There's a moment most people have had that they never quite say out loud, because the honest description of it sounds like something a rational person isn't supposed to believe. You thought of someone and they called. You needed an answer and a stranger handed you one. You dreamed something and then it happened. And the part of your brain trained to explain things found nothing, so it did what it always does. It filed it away and moved on. But here's what's strange. One of the most respected psychiatrists of the 20th century had the same experiences, spent decades quietly building a scientific framework around them, and then sat on that framework for over 20 years, because he knew the moment he published it, his credibility was at risk. Carl Jung had been a peer of Freud, a man whose work the scientific world took seriously, and he chose late in his career to put all of that on the line for an idea that most of his colleagues would reject. That's not the behavior of someone chasing mysticism. That's the behavior of someone who looked at the evidence long enough that he just couldn't ignore it anymore. And now, decades later, science is starting to catch up in ways even Jung couldn't have predicted. What if that filing system is wrong? What if those moments aren't glitches in an otherwise mechanical universe, but signals, faint, barely legible signals from something much larger than any of us can fully see? That's the question this video is really about. And by the end, the answer is going to be stranger and more grounded in actual science than you probably expect. Here's what we're going to cover. We'll start with the man who named this phenomenon and why he waited until late in his career to go public with it, knowing it would cost him. Then we'll get into what modern science is actually uncovering, from quantum physics to biology to the study of collective intelligence, that is starting to make the idea of synchronicity look less like mysticism and more like a testable hypothesis. And the last piece, the one almost no one's talking about, might completely reframe how you think about your own place in the universe. Let's start with Carl Jung, because the story of how synchronicity came to exist as a concept is itself a little synchronistic. Jung was intrigued from early in his career with coincidences, especially those surprising juxtapositions that scientific rationality could not adequately explain. He wasn't a fringe thinker. He was one of the most respected psychiatrists in the world, a peer of Freud, a man who had spent decades building a body of work that the scientific community took seriously. He discussed these ideas with Albert Einstein before World War I, but used the term synchronicity in a 1930 lecture in reference to the unusual psychological insights generated from consulting the I Ching. But here's the thing. He didn't publish his full thesis on it until 1952. He sat on this idea, refined it, and wrestled with it for over 2 decades. And the reason he waited so long is worth understanding. It wasn't that he feared seeming strange. He feared losing credibility, feared being labeled crazy or worse, that they would turn his psychological exploration into a circus. That's why he didn't publish it during his lifetime. At least not in its full form. But when he finally did commit to it, Jung's theory of synchronicities were highly controversial and never had widespread scientific approval. He knew that going in, but he published it anyway. Jung defines synchronicity as the acausal connection of two or more psychic and physical phenomena. More simply, it is the unexplained yet meaningful occurrence of an event in the physical world that is connected to thoughts or emotions in the mind. No cause and effect, just meaning. Two things happen together that seem to share a theme and a message, a coherence, without one causing the other. Jung's use of the concept in arguing for the existence of paranormal phenomena have been widely considered pseudoscientific by modern scientific skepticism. And that's a fair criticism to sit with. The problem isn't that the experiences aren't real, millions of people have had them. The problem is that meaningful coincidence is not a mechanism. It doesn't tell you how. It doesn't give you a testable model. It's more of a label than an explanation. But what's interesting is what happened when Jung tried to find someone who could help him build that model. In 1945, the Viennese physicist Wolfgang Pauli won the Nobel Prize for his work on quantum numbers and the structure of matter. He was one of the most rigorous scientific minds of the 20th century, and he became Jung's closest collaborator on this exact question. The two men collaborated on the synchronicity concept for several years before publishing anything on the topic. Between 1949 and 1952, Pauli reviewed Jung's written drafts and offered many suggestions for developing the concept. In 1952, as the culmination of their collaboration, Jung and Pauli published a joint volume, The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche. Pauli brought to the table was critical. He provided the quantum physics model of acausality, making synchronicity scientifically credible, not merely mystical. Because it turns out the physics had already discovered something that looks, at least structurally, a lot like what Jung was describing. But this is where things get quite interesting. Synchronization and entanglement constitute fundamental phenomena in multi-unit classical and quantum systems, respectively, both equally implying coordinated system states. In other words, the universe already has a documented mechanism by which two separate things can be coordinated without one causing the other. This is what quantum entanglement is called. The state of one particle instantaneously influences the state of another, regardless of the space between them. No signal passes between them, no cause travels from A to B, they simply behave as though they're part of the same thing, because at some deeper level they are. While Pauli and Jung were never able to completely pin down the mechanism of synchronicity, they did conclude the experience must somehow correlate to quantum entanglement. Synchronicity mirrors quantum entanglement, which occurs when two particles link together and influence each other's state no matter how far apart they are, because at the quantum level, the laws governing the interactions of space and time stop behaving according to the principle of causation. And the mainstream scientific position is still that you cannot simply map quantum entanglement on human experience. Particles are not people, the scales are different, and that's a legitimate objection. But here's what makes this more than just a poetic analogy. Researchers have started investigating whether quantum processes are actually operating inside biological systems, including the brain. A study published in 2025 provides empirical statistical evidence that quantum entanglement influences consciousness at a biophysical level. Researchers analyzed data from 106 monozygotic twin pairs. Results captured up to a 31.6% increase in variance across twin responses, while neuroplasticity markers explained a 26% increase in cognitive performance under entangled conditions, providing what research described as robust evidence that quantum entanglement enhances conscious experience. That's not philosophy, that's an actual control study with measurable outcomes. A direct link has been demonstrated for a class of isolated quantum many-body systems, showing that synchronization emerges as an intrinsic system feature. Intriguingly, quantum coherence and entanglement arise persistently through the same process as synchronization. For synchronization, the coordinated behavior of separate things, and entanglement are not just analogous, they appear to be directly linked at the quantum level. Remember the open question from the beginning of the video. What if synchronicity isn't a glitch but some kind of signal? We're getting closer to that. Here's where Dr. Mike Levin, developmental biologist at Tufts University, enters the picture. Levin's work is primarily about how biological systems think, not just brains, but cells, tissues, and entire organisms. His research explores how individual cells, each with their own goals and behaviors, bind together into something that operates as a unified, coherent intelligence. In a 2024 essay, he extended that question outward in a way that's hard to ignore. He asks, if we are made of billions of cells that individually cannot comprehend what we are, where a single neuron has no idea if it's part of a mind that is reading a book or falling in love, then what stops the same logic from scaling up? What if we, as individuals, are in the same position those cells are in, embedded in a system so large and so complex that its patterns are simply beyond our resolution to see clearly? Levin uses a striking example. Around 2016, scientists studying left-right asymmetry in snails went to extraordinary lengths to find a mate for a rare snail named Jeremy. They named him and searched for a compatible partner. The results of that research would go into the scientific record permanently and could eventually help human patients. Jeremy lived and died with absolutely no awareness of any of it. He was the star of an immense, inscrutable drama that gave meaning to his life, a meaning he could never begin to understand. Levin asked the obvious question, would that be us? And then he says something that stopped me cold when I first read it. He writes that if we were embedded in a larger collective intelligence, he thinks the evidence for it would look like synchronicity. Events whose conjunction look like coincidence at the level of physics, no local cause connecting them, which carried a deep meaning that we could just barely begin to perceive. Patterns in our lives and in world events that have no satisfying explanation at the scale of individual moments, which makes sense when you zoom out to the much larger frame. He even offers a useful analogy. Think about the nodes in an artificial neural network. For any individual node, the correlations happening across the network would seem strange and inexplicable. Events would appear oddly connected with no local cause. But of course those connections exist, they're just organized by a global meaning that no single node can access. The pattern is real, the node just can't see it. This is not a mystical claim. Levin is one of the most rigorous biologists working today. He's careful to say we can't simply assume we're cells in a galactic organism and call it a day. That kind of declaration without a research program behind it is, as he puts it, a sterile idea. Beautiful maybe, but not useful. What he's proposing instead is that synchronicity could be the observable signature of a higher order system, and that we need frameworks to actually test it. And this is where things get genuinely strange in the best possible way. Levin points to something called the thanatotranscriptome, a set of genes that activate when an organism is dying. What's remarkable about this is that these genes appear to signal that individual cells are somehow registering that the larger system they belong to is falling apart. The multicellular organism is disbanding, and the cells respond to that fact, even though nothing at their local level necessarily explains why. They're detecting a higher level event that they have no direct access to. If cells can register the dissolution of a collective they're part of, it raises a serious question. Could the reverse be true? Could cells or system of cells register that they are becoming part of something larger? Could that kind of awareness, dim, partial, very legible, be something we experience as meaning? This is the thread that connects Jung's scour beetle in the therapy session to quantum entanglement experiments to developmental biology. The common element is not magic, it's the possibility of a non-local order, coherence that operates at a scale above what local cause and effect can account for. Entanglement and quantum synchronicity are non-local phenomena of a mysterious nature because they cannot be traced back to actions related to the cause-effect principle. Synchronicity manifests itself to a local vision as significant coincidences, with there being a cause-effect relationship between the events considered. Events correlated through entanglement do not occur by chance, but are part of a single quantum process that cannot be separated in space or time into distant parts. Events that are not caused by each other, but are part of a single process. That is not mysticism. That is peer-reviewed physics. Now, none of this proves that synchronicity is real in the way Jung meant it. The scientific community is right to be cautious. Synchronicity is widely challenged by the sufficiency of probability theory in explaining the occurrence of coincidences, relationship between synchronicity experiences and cognitive bias, and doubts about the theory's scientific usefulness. Confirmation bias is real. We notice the hits and forget the misses. Pattern-seeking creatures, and that cuts both ways. How we build science, and it's also how we fool ourselves. But here's what's shifting. The question used to be, is there any mechanism by which synchronicity could be real? And the honest answer was no, not one we could point to. Now the honest answer is different. We've documented non-local correlations in quantum systems. We have evidence of quantum processes influencing biological systems. We have biologists seriously proposing that the signature of a higher order collective intelligence would look exactly like what Jung described. The question is moving from, is there any possible mechanism? How do we build the tools to test this properly? Before getting to the last piece, and this is the one I promised at the start, the one that reframes everything, I want to mention something I've put together that goes deeper into this territory. I've put together a free guide that covers the scientific frameworks researchers are currently using to study non-local coherence, collective intelligence, and the emergent biology of meaning. If this kind of thing generally interests you, it's worth having at a reference. The link will be in the description. You can grab it, it's free. No catch. Anyway, let's do the last piece. So Levin, towards the end of his essay, references a philosophical framework that a number of serious thinkers, including Bernardo Kastrup, have been developing. The idea is this. Rather than consciousness being something that emerges from matter, matter might be something that emerges from consciousness. Universal mind, vast and unified, but fragmented, and that we're those fragments. Not metaphorically, structurally, literally. And if that's true, then synchronicity isn't something that happens to us from the outside. It's more like a signal from the rest of ourselves. A moment where the fragmentation thins and the underlying coherence briefly becomes visible. Levin is careful not to declare this true. He says we probably can't ever prove it definitively. There are mathematical limits related to Gödel and Turing on what any system can know about the larger system it's embedded in. It cannot prove it's in a body, for example. A neuron cannot prove it's in a mind. But it can gather evidence of that. It can notice patterns that don't make sense at its own scale, but do make sense at a higher one. And that's what we're doing. That's what Jung was doing in 1952 when he published that essay knowing it would damage his reputation. Pauli was doing when he, a Nobel laureate in physics, spent years working with psychiatrists on a concept his colleagues would have laughed at. That's what biologists like Levin are doing now when they ask whether the behavior of dying cells might be our best current model for how subunits detect the state of the system they belong to. The question isn't settled. It may never be fully settled. But the ground has shifted dramatically from where it was even 10 years ago. We have quantum non-locality, we have evidence of quantum effects in biological cognition, we have rigorous biologists exposing that synchronicity is the observable fingerprint of a higher order intelligence, and we have a growing number of researchers who are no longer laughing at the question, trying to figure out how to test it. And the next time something happens that feels like it cannot be a coincidence, you don't have to choose between it means everything and it means nothing. There's a third option now, and science is slowly, carefully building a path toward it. Maybe what you're experiencing is real. Maybe it's a pattern that exists at a scale you can't fully see. Maybe you're a node in the network catching a faint signal from something much larger. Something that, like Jeremy This Now, you are part of in ways you will never fully understand. Jung knew that idea was dangerous to career. He published it anyway. Tells you something about how seriously he took it. If you want to keep pulling on this thread, the video on collective intelligence and the biology of consciousness, natural next step, I think it will surprise you. See you soon.